As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So senior U.S. officials speaking to Politico on Wednesday have reaffirmed that the Biden administration intends to place no conditions on future military aid to Israel, despite public comments suggesting the idea was under consideration. So amid growing calls from Democrats to condition military aid to Israel, President Biden told reporters recently that the idea is a worthwhile thought, but U.S. officials are saying it will not happen, saying that it is not something the U.S. is currently pursuing. And these comments from Biden that it's something worth thinking about must have set off some alarm bells in Israel and among hawks in the U.S., because you have all these officials now, saying, no, don't worry about it. It's still unconditional, which is really something if you think about it. There's absolutely no conditions on these weapons that we're sending to Israel. No matter what they do, we're going to keep doing it. Doesn't matter. And these comments come, the comments walking back what Biden said, they come as we were seeing all these reports that say the U.S. is trying to pressure Israel on its campaign in the south. Once the hostage deal truce resumes, they're expected to expand military operations in southern Gaza, where there's hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinians who fled the north. So Gaza in the south is even more densely populated than normal. So the civilian casualties are expected to be even worse than what we saw in the past month and a half, almost 2 months now. So anyway, we're seeing all these reports saying, and also public comments from Biden officials saying that we're not going to support their campaign in the South if they don't take account for the civilians that are there. But at the same time, it's unconditional, so it doesn't really matter. So you are going to support it, whether you say you are or not, because you're funding this military. So The Economist reported on Tuesday that internal polling in Ukraine shows that Zelensky could lose a presidential election if he faces off with General Valery Zaluzhny, who's the Ukrainian commander-in-chief. So far, Zaluzhny has not expressed an interest in entering into politics, but he's been rumored to be a potential candidate for a long time. I feel like for the past year, I've seen these kind of rumors that Zaluzhny is a potential opponent of Zelensky if there ever is a election. And it's also been reported that Zaluzhny and Zelensky have been at odds with each other, and this spat spilled out into the public recently after Zaluzhny was very candid about the situation on the battlefield. He called the war against Russia a stalemate, said there would likely be no deep and beautiful breakthrough. So there's a quote here from Zelensky that I actually missed, and he took a pretty, a swipe at Zaluzhny and other generals for saying things like that, and it's strange. So Zelensky said, quote, "If a military man decided to do politics, it is his right. Then he should enter politics, and then he can't deal with war," end quote. So basically saying, shut up, Zaluzhny. And he's not really talking politics. He's talking about the situation on the battlefield. He is Ukraine's top general. So I'm sure that did not sit right with Zaluzhny. And polling shows that Ukrainian public trust is much higher when it comes to Zaluzhny. They trust Zaluzhny much more than Zelensky, according to these polls that were viewed by The Economist. And the report reads that the figures, which date from mid-November, show that trust in the president has fallen to a net plus 32%. So these are a net percentage. So that doesn't mean that it's only 32%. I forget exactly how it's worked out, but it's like they subtract the people who don't trust Zelensky from the people who do, the percentage of people who do, and they get that number 32%. But Zaluzhny is plus 32%. Zaluzhny is plus 70%. So that's more than double what Zelensky is. And Ukraine's spy chief, Kirilo Budanov, who's responsible for a lot of the assassinations that we're seeing, he also has a better rating than the president at plus 45%. So Ukraine's next presidential election is scheduled for March 2024, but Zelensky has ruled out holding one during the war because Ukraine's constitution prohibits holding a vote under martial law. So that's the excuse that Zelensky is using. So this is some good news. This was reported by Responsible Statecraft on Wednesday, and it says that Senator Rand Paul is planning to force a vote on a resolution that he introduced to withdraw all U.S. troops from Syria, as U.S. bases in the country have come under frequent attack since mid-October. Paul introduced the resolution on November 15th, and it would order the removal of the approximately 900 U.S. troops that are stationed in Syria within 30 days unless President Biden receives authorization for war from Congress. Sources told Responsible Statecraft that the vote could happen as early as next week. Earlier this year, Matt Gaetz, over in the House, he's a Republican from Florida, he introduced a similar resolution which failed pretty badly in a vote of 103 to 321. According to the Pentagon, there has been at least 73 attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria, including over 30 in Syria, so it's roughly half and half. So this is a good time, I think, for Rand Paul to force a vote on this when you have U.S. troops coming under constant attack. I wish more of these guys that, like Gates, people who have been good on this before, were more outspoken about the risk of the U.S. getting dragged into a war in the Middle East. But unfortunately, a lot of them are all about supporting and funding Israel, and all that stuff goes out the window when it comes to Israel, the whole ending wars thing.
Here's Gerald Celente with today's trends in the news.
The one I'm writing about here, this will scandalize people to know that this is a law, suspends the Fourth Amendment protections for a class of persons. Now, the Fourth Amendment doesn't protect just Americans. It protects persons, good persons, bad persons, Americans, non-Americans, people the government likes, those that do what the government tells them to do, and people the government hates, those that resist and challenge the government. But the Congress has suspended the Fourth Amendment for foreign persons communicating from outside the United States into the United States, foreign people in the U.S. communicating to foreigners outside, foreign people inside the U.S. communicating to each other, and foreign people communicating to Americans. So if you're an American talking to a foreign person, for the purpose of that communication, your Fourth Amendment rights have been suspended. What does that mean? It means the government can engage in surveillance without suspicion, without probable cause, without a search warrant. That's the law. That law, known as Section 702 of the FISA Act, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, expires on December 31st of this year, a month from now, and it is up for renewal. And Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, when he was Congressman Johnson, voted against its extension 5 years ago, spoke against its extension 5 years ago, and said, as Congressman Johnson, there should be an up or down vote on this because the majority of the House is against it. But as Speaker Johnson, he's in favor of extending it and will not permit an up or down vote. They're going to take this and bury it in the NDAA. What's the NDAA? The National Defense Authorization Act, basically the appropriations for the Defense Department. So nobody is going to vote against funding the Defense Department in order to oppose this thing, and we'll never know who opposed it because they buried it in the middle of this 1,000-page piece of legislation. That's the government today. That's the Republican leadership in the House of Representatives today, trashing the Constitution.
Well, they're all trashing it. It's one after another. They're all, again, you mentioned that this happened under Bush administration and Dick Cheney, with this whole 9/11 baloney. And again, look at the great success they've had since 9/11 in all their spying. Look at the great accomplishments they've achieved. How about absolutely nothing? Yet it costs us trillions of dollars and robs us of our freedom.
For a while, the FBI was engaged in these setups where they find some sort of a disaffected Muslim young man and they approach him in some facility and they ingratiate themselves with him and they say, hey, I can sell you powder to blow up a subway. And he goes to press the button.
I remember that.
It's really flour. And then they say, look how we saved you and all of our surveillance saved you. They made the whole thing up.
Yep.
We haven't seen too much of that lately because the FBI has gotten more sophisticated. So not only do they take advantage of the Fourth Amendment being suspended for foreigners, they may very well induce a phone call to you or me or any unsuspecting American as to whom there's no probable cause of crime from a foreign person. And that communication legally can be surveilled. And it doesn't end there. They will go to foreign social media digital companies, even those located in the US, Facebook, and buy data of foreign persons and mine the data to see if they've communicated with Americans. There is no end to what the government will go through to insinuate itself into our private lives. Thank you, Mike Johnson.
And again, it's you right here. Question: can Congress modify a constitutional requirement? Answer: no. If it could, the Constitution would no longer be the supreme law of the land, but rather a facade subject to prevailing political winds. And that's exactly what it's become. I mean, you're talking here about, the Fourth Amendment. How about the First Amendment? We could start from the number one and go all the way through. Freedom of speech. I mean, they've robbed us of everything. This is very sad what's going on. And if the people don't unite against this, and unfortunately, there's nobody running for president that I see that could change any of this. They were going to overthrow the government. There were 39 weeks of major protests. Totally forgotten. Totally forgotten. So I believe Netanyahu knew it, and he wanted it to happen. They do it all the time. Again, we've both talked about what happened following the Great Depression, World War II. What followed the dot-com bust? The war on terror. So that's the way I see it.
Well, Netanyahu likes to compare himself to FDR. FDR surely knew that Pearl Harbor was going to happen, and he allowed 2,700 young sailors to be sitting ducks and murdered on December 7th, 1941. So it would flip American public opinion. It flipped it almost exactly. It was 80% against entering World War II on December 7th. On December 9th, it was 80% in favor of entering World War II. So he succeeded.
Yep.
One of the greatest acts of mass murder in history. And did George W. know about 9/11? Well, the Israelis knew about 9/11. They were celebrating in Jersey City across the Hudson River, filming the destruction of the World Trade Towers as it was happening. Who were they? Mossad.
Yep. That's it. And people believe what they're being fed. So, Judge, thank you for being on. And everybody, please do what you can to support peace, because
your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
And so you would see these bizarre anomalies like that. Like, what would make you think? And so, in particular, if we look in some parts of Asia, you would see that it looked like no matter what you did, you got basically the same result. And sometimes you got a basically pretty good result. So you had South Korea with its massive testing, but then you had Japan with its very lackluster testing and their refusal to test people without symptoms. And they had a lackluster lockdown and all this other stuff. And they basically did fine. So it looks like the policy, as you said earlier, Nick, just doesn't correspond certainly with better results anywhere. And yet it seems like it should. On some level, it seems like this should have helped. It seems like it ought to have helped. And I say that as somebody who is dead set against lockdowns and all the rest of it. It seems like it should have done some good. And it is absolutely bizarre to me that it didn't.
Yeah, a more common objection that we receive, and one that maybe we should respond to, is, okay, so if you had this effect of standards of care changing, would it have been the same wouldn't it have been the same in other countries? But because everybody locked down, there were lots of lockdowns around and so on. But what we point to there is that some of these effects are quite subtle, so they depend on the degree to which there was a take-up of the policies. And the example we like to refer to is from a pre-COVID phenomenon. There's a phenomenon known as the weekend effect. If you're going to go to hospital, it's much better to go to hospital on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. On the weekend, there's generally lower levels of healthcare worker attendance. And that's associated with higher mortality, as in notably higher mortality. And that's for a hospital operating under normal conditions where they're supposedly trying to do the best for their patients and so on. There's no emergency conditions. So if you layer on an environment of fear and a sense of some kind of state of disaster, and you're terrifying the healthcare workers. I mean, I remember back in the early days in South Africa, there would be a tradition of banging pots and pans at the times of day when the healthcare workers were supposedly going into work or leaving work, with the idea being that they were marching into their deaths. Meanwhile, the reality was that for any vaguely healthy under 70-year-old, the mortality rate from COVID is negligible. So they weren't actually going into any kind of dangerous environment, but they were being consistently told that they were. And this must have changed their attitude towards their patients, the likelihood that they would spend time in the physical presence of the people who were ill, especially these frail elderly people. And we know very well from RCU statistical investigations that the presence of healthcare workers in the immediate environments of the patient is crucially important. If you take that away, things go wrong without being noticed, and people
there's
die.
Plenty of testimony of people both in care homes and in hospitals of how people, they were told to minimize contact with patients. They were told to keep the door shut and only check on them every few hours. There's obviously a huge number of people in different jurisdictions who pretty clear the relatives think that their elderly loved ones died of dehydration or neglect, and putting the term broadly. So it's a very complex picture. And just to expand on what Nick was saying, that there's a tendency to try to systematize the analysis of lockdown effects. So you've got your lockdown stringency index, for example, and that includes things like, well, did they shut what size grocery stores did they shut? Did they shut gyms? Did they shut schools and everything? But the fact is that those aren't where the deaths occurred, and those stringency indexes are largely useless for analytical purposes. What you actually have to get into is the weeds of what actually was done to vulnerable people. Because New York aside, which is a bit of a weird case, across most of the world, it's pretty much accepted that the people who died were elderly and vulnerable health, and vulnerable health problems. So it's really what happened in care homes and in hospitals where they were receiving elderly people with respiratory illnesses, or out in the community, how elderly people were being treated with a respiratory illness. That's what determines outcome from whatever happened. So if you take, for example, Germany, well, Germany has huge overcapacity in its health system. So it was able to accommodate a disruption in a relatively kind of disciplined and non-hysterical way, in which they the system didn't fall apart. Well, I can tell you that in the UK, that the National Health Service runs at very, very high capacity all the time, and it's always stretched. It's always on the edge of breaking down. It's pretty easy to see how if you dramatically change the way people are told to work and react to patients with testing and isolation and separating patients off, it is not difficult to see how that would be a health disaster. As Nick said, we had a few years ago, one of the health minister in the UK, he had a campaign. One of his things he wanted to bring in was, I want a 7-day NHS, for exactly the reason that Nick gave, which is that patients at the weekend had a worse outcome. So you can imagine if that was detectable as a worse outcome, just as lowering of staffing levels at the weekend. Well, you can imagine when people have to, the health workers having to isolate for 10 days because somebody in their child's school tested positive or whatever, they have to stay at home. It was, the times were completely insane.
The Peter Schiff Show. That in my absence, the gold price managed to get above $2,000. And then in the last couple of days, rallied some more. In fact, gold was up about $25 today, and it's up again in the evening, up about another $8, $9. It's almost at $20 and $2,050 per ounce. So I believe their all-time record high was $2,080 per ounce. So we're almost there. But I think what's going to be substantial is once we get above that, I'd say maybe 2,100, just to kind of put a little cushion between the old record high and the price of gold. I think the price is going to move up dramatically in a short period of time. I mean, gold should already be much higher than where it is. I think it's kind of been a gift horse that the price has stayed so low. Although silver, talk about a gift horse, I think the silver price is a much greater deal. I mean, silver has to about double to hit its record high. Gold is only about 1% below its record high. But gold stocks have to go up about 50% just to get back to where they were at their peak in 2020. But if you're talking about when gold hit its record in 2011, which is pretty much about the same price it's at right now, maybe a little bit lower back then. The record might have been slightly lower than the current price. For gold stocks to get back to where they were in 2011, the GDX, which is the senior producers, that has to double from here. And the juniors, which, the GDXJ, which is an index of junior gold miners, has to almost increase fivefold. Those stocks are down almost 80% in the last 12, 13 years, even though the price of gold has stayed the same. Right? It's still right around the 2000 high that it hit in 2011. And a lot of that is because of the sentiment. There's just so much negative sentiment out there that this Fed inflation fight is going to somehow kill gold. The Fed is just going to be so tough and so resolute in bringing inflation back down to 2% that it's just going to hammer gold. And so nobody wants to buy these mining stocks. The reality is the Fed is not going to win the inflation fight. In fact, it's already lost. And I think that's going to be more apparent in the months ahead, particularly if we get a breakdown in the dollar, which is starting. The dollar index is now down at about 102.5. It continues to weaken. It was down again today. And I think we're getting very close to a breakdown in the dollar and then a crash in the dollar. And the breakdown in the dollar should, kind of correlate with the breakout in gold, because that's what people are doing when they're selling their dollars. They're buying gold. They're getting rid of a fiat currency and they're buying real money. And this is going to be a huge problem. It's a game changer for the Fed, because when the dollar really starts to tank, that's going to put a lot of upward pressure on consumer prices and interest rates, and ultimately unemployment. You're going to see unemployment going up, inflation going up, and interest rates going up all at the same time. I mean, talk about a misery index. It's going to hit record highs potentially by the 2024 election, which is why I've said it's going to be so difficult for Biden to be reelected in an economic environment that's going to be that drastic. So much more money has been printed. The fiscal predicament is so much graver now than it was back then when I was talking about $5,000 gold. Of course, when I was talking about $5,000 gold, it wasn't that far away. Gold was almost $2,000, so it didn't even have that far to go. But now my price target is substantially higher. So I think there's a lot more money that will be made in the mining stocks when gold finally breaks out and investors, the bears on these stocks, throw in the towel. I was watching on CNBC just yesterday, when they were commenting on the markets, and they talked about the stock market, they talked about the bond market, the oil market, Bitcoin, but no mention of gold at all. In fact, I didn't even hear them mention it today. Not like I watched nonstop, but I watch it occasionally, and they talk about it. I didn't hear anybody mention gold today. Now, maybe somebody did when I wasn't watching, but I wonder how high it's going to have to go before it grabs anybody's attention. Personally, I prefer a stealth bull market. The fewer people that hop on board, the better. Let the price move up a lot more before the mainstream investor starts to notice how much the price of gold has gone up and how much the mining stocks have gone up. I'd rather have them go up before the general public buys. But I want my audience to buy now. I don't want them to buy later and pay higher prices. I'd rather get them on board. And it also means that all of our strategies, if the dollar is going to tank the way I think it's going, then our foreign stocks are going to do very well because they're non-dollar. Plus, a lot of them have exposure to commodities, and I think in a weak dollar environment, which is where we're headed, those stocks are going to flourish.
The whole issue here is lying. And I think there's a famous quote, probably everybody in this audience has heard it maybe more than once, and I'm going to put it up because it tells you a lot about how people think about lying. And it's the Goring quote. I want to put that up, and I'm going to read that, and because this tells you, a person that we're seeing as the epitome of evil, actually spouting something off. It was pretty well the honest truth as he faced death at Nuremberg. So I'm going to go ahead and read this because it's a whole lot of information here. He said, of course, and he was interviewed as he was a prisoner, and within days that he was convicted, and then he killed himself trying to avoid the killing by the government. He says, and this is Goring, why, of course the people don't want war. Why should some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war neither in Russia, nor in England, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That's easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the peacemakers for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. Well, I'll tell you what, that is some quote considering where it's coming from. Somebody that was going to commit suicide or be killed within days and was being tried for what was going on, during the Hitler warmongering in World War II. But it's obvious that they live lies, and yet you get a mouthful of truth. And I see that in comparison to most of what we hear from our politicians, where they're not the total blatant lies. Sometimes it's just fibbing and demagoguing and politicking and everything. But they don't live with a bundle of truth like we have here.
Yet there's never any repercussions for, as you call them correctly, these big lies. It's only the little lies as to whether his Ferragamo shoes are 6 years old or 1 year old. Those are the ones they want to get him on, not the big lies of the others.
Yeah, but they always promise good things. If they're talking about foreign policy and the need to spend money and send kids off to war for peace, for prosperity, and always for democracy. We have to protect democracy. And democracy, but they never say, you know, we ought to reconsider the fact of restoring the republic that we were given, which was clearly given to us. But no, does any school, you know, teach the difference of that? Why should they? Because they're government schools. The schools are there, you know, to teach people how to have this distortion of the truth. So it involves so many things. Right now, I think there's a lot of lies told about the climate, and nobody knows what to believe. And fortunately, people are waking up. They're just getting sick and tired of it. They're catching on. The government lies to it, and yet they're very gullible. And you know, like Goring says, you can't have patriotism. Use patriotism and lie to them, and they will always go along. You know, we hear lies about what's going on our borders. You know, they're involved in medicine. Think of all the lies told, and the people who were punished over COVID. And that was, you talk about a conspiracy of lies, you know, and that was so bad. You know, the combination of big corporations, the pharmaceuticals, along with governments, is still going on, where the true fascism or corporatism exists. And then they can flip that around into people who are fighting all this. They're called, you know, the fascists, you know. So it's all based on how they can lie their way out of the system. But you know, they always say, you know, when the other biggest lie that I've talked about for quite a few years is the lies about money. That they have convinced people that as long as the government gives us money, as long as they spend money, that we will have prosperity. And so where are we now by living with this? And that's been for 100 years. It's being questioned now, which is great because it doesn't work and people are getting poorer. But all they say is we have to have a flexible monetary system. We have to have a government management of it. You can't have the market determining this. And it's all based on a fraudulent arguments. I mean, we have the counterfeiters in charge, and hardly anybody stands up and say enough is enough. But more and more, and we're going to keep plugging away there. But I think, you know, some of the big ones, certainly the oath of office is a real big one. The money issue is a real big one. The justification for foreign policy, Daniel, I think is a horror. That's why I use that quote, just to show how those who were perpetuating it knew how to do it. And it was sort of a confession, I assume, but it's just an interesting statement by Goring.